Hi, Gene.
Okay, today's lecture is about William Jefferson Clinton, who is the 42nd President of the United States of America and was one of the youngest. He was 43 when he came to serve. He was born in Arkansas. He went to Georgetown, then spent a time in Oxford, then came back and went to Yale Law School. At Yale, he met his future wife, who later became a partner with him in the presidency, Hillary Rodham Clinton. When Yale was over, they went back to Arkansas. They've had one child, a daughter. Clinton ran for governor and was elected, and Hillary Clinton went to work for the Rose law firm. It is from those days that troubles began to percolate. When Clinton decided to run for the presidency, he was facing an uphill battle. The Bush, who was in the presidency, had high ratings, and then suddenly he broke a promise to the Republican elite that he would never raise taxes. He kept saying, "Read my lips." But at the end, he decided he had to raise taxes due to the economy. And that broken promise and the fact that a man who was really unhappy with the North American Free Trade Agreement ran on a third ticket meant that finally the Democrats were able to take the White House back. Almost as soon as they began to rally their crowd, President Clinton to-be and his wife had to do a TV interview about their marital life. It was difficult, but they did a good job. And just like Nixon in his Checkers speech, the Clintons came out on the better side. And so it was, they moved to the White House. Almost immediately, things went wrong. One of the people that came with them from Arkansas, named Foster, almost immediately committed suicide, an event that shook up the leadership. And then before that could settle down, there had been a commotion about getting a woman as Attorney General for the first time. And so it was that Janet Reno was nominated and approved. Reno then had a test of wills that involved Waco, Texas. In a town right outside of Waco, a small town, a group of cultists known as the Branch Davidians began a major demonstration. The FBI was of two minds. They waited for over 50 days in a siege, and then the hardliners in the FBI advised Janet Reno to take control of the building. And so there was a rush at the building. They'd already gotten some of the children out earlier in a deal that they made in these long 50+ days of negotiating. And the other side of the FBI wanted to continue that process, but the hardliners said no. Reno went with the hardliners. They rushed the building, somehow either by using a grenade that exploded and caught fire, or just by fire itself, the building caught on fire. Over 50 children died in that fire, along with many women and quite a few of the Branch Davidians. This was a very difficult time for the first year of this administration. And it was to be followed a year later when two men really true terrorists, decided that the federal government was the enemy, and they were influenced what happened in Waco, Texas. And so they took a large van, loaded it with dynamite, and parked it very close to the federal building in Oklahoma City. And then they ignited the fuse and the van exploded. Unfortunately, it was next to the windows that looked into the child care center. So all the children were killed, as were many members of the federal government. These were not good signs for an administration that already had its unique problems. Nevertheless, the Clintons decided they would have an attempt to change the nature of American medical practices. They would get a national health care program. And Mrs. Clinton, who had said, if you voted for Bill, you got her too, she was appointed to be the chair of that committee. The kindest words that could be said about her chairwomanship was that it went quite badly. Little did she know the enormous influence of the American Medical Association, who were totally committed to fee-for-service medicine. And so it was that after much struggling, and with her out not listening to the better advisors that she could have had, this attempt failed. And it failed in such a way that they had both promised that for re-election, they should be judged on the success of this program. And as it was, the program was a failure. It was a time that was difficult. Number one, they only had 2 years of good relations with the Congress. And then the Republicans took control of the House and the Senate. And in that group that took control was a man from Georgia known as Newt Gingrich. It would be fair to say, and say nicely, that he was not a nice person. And he offered up a program distinctly different from the Clintons. We call that the contract with America. And so the battle signs were up, as were the battle sieges, and we went forward. In the group that went forward, of course, you had a vice president, Al Gore, and you had a rather large cabinet. One of the most distinguished members of the cabinet and a very prominent African American was Colin Powell. Colin came from a whole different world that the Clintons did not know. While born in the United States, he was born of Jamaican parents. Jamaica and what his parents knew gave them a different outlook on the America that existed at the time of the Clintons. Slavery had not lasted long in Jamaica, for both Britain and France ended the slave trade early, so that the families of Jamaican blacks had not been split into many different sections and sold off one by one. The families remained intact. So when Colin Powell's family came to the United States to live from Jamaica, they had a view that was different than the views of most African Americans coming out of the South. That is the American South. So it was that Colin Powell, while he became a distinguished military man, he did not go to West Point. his family thought it would be better to go to a traditional American university, and so he did. When he came into the administration, he saw what he thought was a convoluted mess. Basically, he could not understand how the cabinet worked when most of the time they were meetings that reminded him of bull sessions back at his university when men sat around at night and just talked. And also Vice President Gore was quite upset with these sessions and complained in front of everybody directly to the president that you send us all out looking at problems and offering solutions, and then we just let them sit here. It's just a talking session. It's not an acting and doing section. And we need to do that because the other side, known as the Republicans, are in control of the House and the Senate, and they have their agenda called the Contract for America. So it was that the battle scenes were drawn and an attempt was made to move forward. The process of movement became slow. So, as often happens in American domestic politics, Clinton turned to foreign affairs. He was the first American president to visit Vietnam after our debacle there. He was also attempting to follow in President Carter's footsteps by inviting to Camp David the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the head of the PLO, Yasser Arafat. The result were as tragic as the results were when, in fact, Sadat and Menachem Begin had met at Camp David decades before. Rabin was trying to build peace around the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords became a very famous Broadway play at this time, recounting the negotiations that went on at Oslo. Rabin's attempt brought him a terrible end.
I don't think I have the sound.
Somebody's not muting themselves.
Always.
I'm back to Rabin. Because Rabin tried to make this peace offer, he was assassinated in Israel, not by a Muslim, not by a Palestinian, not by an Arab, but by an Israeli opposed to peace. The cost of peace in the Middle East got steeper and steeper. At the same time, our President Clinton, got drawn into the Iraqi situation. He made those claims that they were trying to build nuclear weapons, trying to build other kinds of terror weapons. He convinced the British Prime Minister that the Americans and the Brits should set up a no-fly zone, limiting the ability of Iraq to sponsor aggression abroad. At the same time, another problem arose. There was a breakdown in what was the nation called Yugoslavia. And as it broke into many different pieces, Bosnia, Serbia, Herzegovina, there was a part that was Islamic. And in an attempt to keep it from breaking to a point where there was ethnic cleansing, or in a better word, a genocide, particularly against the Muslim minority that was in Kosovo, Clinton tried to convince, and they finally agreed to join, convince the Germans, who agreed to join, an effort by NATO to bring some settlement to this area. In the process, the Chinese embassy was accidentally bombed. This is the Red Chinese embassy, bombed in the capital of Belgrade, which made the Chinese less than happy. Clinton later apologized for that bombing of their embassy, and the Chinese seemed to accept it. But not accepting the quid pro quo that was going on was Iran. And suddenly, surprisingly, an Iranian huge Airbus arrived in former Yugoslavia with weapons for the Muslim minority. And so suddenly you had Middle Eastern interference in what was thought to be NATO's backyard. And it was also a very unhappy thing in Europe to see German military forces leaving Germany to fight somewhere in Europe again, given that World War II and Nazi aggression had not been forgotten, particularly in France and Britain, which are also tied into this effort to bring peace to the former Yugoslavia. So wherever he seemed to turn, Mr. Clinton met various points of debate, but he kept pushing away. He had made some decisions that he would, like others, not go to Harvard, but to go to Berkeley to get good, solid advice. And so he brought a Berkeley economist, Laura Tyson, to work as his economic advisor. But that wasn't the end of the story for Berkeley, because the chancellor at Berkeley, who himself was very controversial, left Berkeley and went to work as a legal advisor in the Department of Commerce. And he was not happy with that position for long and wanted to move from there to the Scientific Advisory Board and then as the director of the Smithsonian Institute. Sitting on that board was Vice President Al Gore, who voted against Chancellor Heyman because he said, truthfully, Heyman had no scientific background. He was basically a lawyer and a former chancellor. He'd also left a problematic issue that blew up on the campus. Heyman was the first Jewish chancellor to ever serve at Berkeley. And when he got there, he found many, many complaints from old blues. Those are people who've graduated Berkeley and have children, and their children aren't getting into Berkeley. And instead, a large number of Asian, particularly Chinese students, are in fact exceedingly excellent grades. They're bringing those grades with them to Berkeley. Now, Heyman, when he was at Bolt as a lawyer, had complained bitterly that Harvard, Yale, and other Ivies had a Jewish quota, a limit on the number of Jews that could attend. And now Heyman was betwixt and between because he was advised and decided to do so, to have a Chinese quota to limit the number of Chinese who could be accepted at the University of California at Berkeley. He left just in time to avoid the explosion. The man who replaced him was chancellor at the time down at Irvine. He was a mechanical engineer, but he was also Chinese. And when this chancellor arrived at California Hall to discover that there was a Chinese quota, the lid blew off the quota system, and all those involved were thrown out of California Hall. If they were like Mac Lech, they had tenure, they went back to their departments. If they didn't have tenure, they just left. Because this Chinese chancellor was not allowing any China quota at the University of California at Berkeley. So these various issues could never be contained, nor could there be a containment of all the cults that were operating, and many of them right there at Berkeley. Helter Skelter is a book. It's about a dreadful man who went down south with a cult following and murdered Sharon Tate, her unborn child, and other people in her entourage. And also there had been, before that, a terrible incident in which a man had organized a group, a cult, that followed him down to Jonestown in South America, in Guyana. And there, he made a decision, having already met many people in powerful positions like George Moscone, mayor of San Francisco. He made a decision that they all should commit suicide. And he laced the Kool-Aid with cyanide. And then it was either forced on or taken voluntarily by a huge number of people who committed suicide. So these blows to the party politics of this nation, particularly with these cults, did not help bring a peaceful domestic scene to the later Clinton administration. And so it was that they tried to struggle through their own cult, which of course was the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, and then the Oklahoma City bombing, leaving America quite distraught over the nature and the direction in which they were going. And then suddenly appearing on the scene was a Republican majority, both in the House and in the Senate, and the leadership falling to Newt Gingrich and his contract with America. But we struggled on. Other California people, particularly professors at Berkeley, arrived in Washington. They were invited to look over a possible appointment. One was my friend Chalmers Johnson, famous as a Japanese specialist, Japanese and Chinese. He made it obvious that he would only serve if America would learn not to rent its navy to the Japanese, because already there was strife over the issue of the number of things the Japanese seemed to get as a free rider. Needless to say, Chalmers did not get the job. So it was that the Clintons had to fight on almost alone to try and contain both domestic and foreign issues. When they moved in various directions, they almost always found themselves blocked. They were particularly distraught over the failure of healthcare during their time in power. They had visited the French capital, Paris, to see how the French system worked. There was a famous woman in Paris who had in fact instituted the latest changes, and they seemed to be working with great aplomb. But the danger of bringing to America a system as loaded as a foreign political system, either in healthcare or where else, always had a blowback problem. And that problem was to distinguish it from the American one was difficult to do, and the inheritance coming from abroad was difficult for Americans to accept. Slowly but surely, though, another trapdoor opened that was impossible to avoid. Not only was Bill Clinton quite young when he became president, he liked to go jogging. You could see him around the White House grounds and sometimes running down the main streets of Pennsylvania Avenue on his morning jog. He also had an eye for women. One would have thought at 40 plus and with a daughter that the roving eye would rove no more, but that was not the case. And slowly but surely, first coming out of a scandal associated with Whitewater and an investment back in Arkansas, and then with several women in Arkansas, and then when the Arkansas police offered newsworthy events of how they were asked to set up women for the governor of Arkansas, that governor being Clinton, that this began not to play well. You see, the funny thing in American politics is that there is a very moralistic streak, phony or not, Puritan or not, it's there. It's not there in continental European politics. Let me give you an example. Why not choose Italian politics? In the Italian government, there was elected a prostitute to serve in that parliament. Her name was Ciccolina. Italians laughed about it, but Rome did not fall. It still governed, it still learned to go from day to day, and Ciccolina continued her political as well as other careers. Let's move from Rome to Paris. When Mitterrand was ill, and it became evident he was going to die, he suggested he would like his funeral to be in Notre Dame. And so it came to be. And in Notre Dame, sitting on one side was his wife of many years, and sitting on the other side was his mistress of many years. And I'm here to tell you that the cathedral did not fall down. It was one of those sort of accepted facts of life to Europeans that marital bliss was not always so blissful. Now, if you turn your attention to the Anglo-American situation, that is a very different story. Let's just move across the channel to London. There was a minister in the government in London who was married. His name was Profumo. And he had a girlfriend, Christine Keeler. And he failed to check on Keeler's other boyfriends, one of which was the Soviet naval attaché in London. So when all this became headline news in London, Profumo was, of course, expected to step down, which he did. And Keeler became a headline event for the London press. In America, it can be even worse. And so it was that we began a long and tedious process. One was named Paula. One was named Jennifer. But the one that got the biggest headlines initially was a 22-year-old intern working in the White House. And she was done no favor by her friend who gave the day away by telling a man who came from Pepperdine University in Southern California and became the investigator in the Clinton White House affair. Stories about a blue dress. Stories about an encounter between the President of the United States and this intern, Monica Lewinsky. And once it was loose, the press would not let go. The investigations proceeded. The dress was actually found and presented as evidence under dire conditions. The president was asked to give a blood test. His DNA matched the DNA on the dress. A committee for impeachment was founded in the House. It was quite obvious, although not obvious to Clinton, because he thought even if the impeachment proceeded, it would never get a formal, final, positive vote for impeachment. And yet it did. It was difficult times. Hillary had to live through this. They had known other famous women who had not been involved sexually with the president in their own first big formal affair, the presidential inaugural ball. Barbara Streisand had attended. Streisand later stayed with them in the White House and slept in the Lincoln bedroom. Another personality in Hollywood who thought she could give the Clintons political advice along with Streisand was Sharon Stone. When you have advisors like Streisand and Stone, you don't need many enemies. So it was that they moved forward. By then, the Clintons' daughter was older. They tried to shield her from the impact. But the vote went against Clinton. Clinton then offered a very lame excuse. He maintained that the affair he had with this intern was not sex, because the things they did were not sex as sex is defined between a man and a woman. He had never been able to get these conflict straight in his own life and in his early political life. When he came into the White House, he had decided that he would be much more generous to gays, and he wanted gays to be able to serve openly in the US military. So he instituted a policy of don't ask, don't tell, so that gays could, in fact, serve, as they had already been serving, but serving in the closet inside the military. But then right behind that, fearing this Republican Congress, he offered up a Defense of Marriage Act. That Defense of Marriage Act maintained that marriage in America was only between a man and a woman. This then destroyed his relationship with the gay community, who were furious at this backtracking. And the Supreme Court soon found the act to be unconstitutional. And this was a court that had been influenced by two very important nominees of Bill Clinton. One was Stephen Breyer, and the other was a very, very famous woman who is hanging on in the Supreme Court day by day, cancer by cancer, chemo by chemo, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But unfortunately for Clinton, with one hand he gave and with the other hand he took away. Give you another example. Even though the Reagan administration had tried with Nancy Reagan doing her best in a just say no campaign to drugs, the whole process of recreational drugs had bloomed aplenty in America, and the use of marijuana was widespread. And in this spread, Mr. Clinton, instead of remaining mute, stepped into the forefront and said he had indeed smoked marijuana when he was governor and leader. But, he said, I never inhaled. So with one hand he giveth, and with the other hand he taketh away, because he offered. There are comedians who are actually Republicans who are not in office. Their job is comedy. And those comedians said he couldn't even get that right. He didn't know how to inhale. Not a good sign. Not a constructive note to build on, particularly when you were facing Newt Gingrich and company, waiting for you to fall on your face, hoping to see you in disarray, and of course, to do what is going to happen, which is take the White House back for the Republicans. It was an amazing show of greatly disconcerted people. By that time, Dianne Feinstein, better known to her friends here in the Bay Area as Di-Fi, was in the Senate. And she actually believed Clinton when initially he denied the charges that he had had sex with Monica Lewinsky. And now she found that he had not told the truth. And she was most upset by that, even though, of course, in the Senate, they did not accept the verdict of the House. And so Clinton was able to live out his term, but under this tremendous cloud and particularly as the various women scored their money. To shut up Paula, they paid her $850,000. And the first thing she did was go out and get a nose job. She had never liked her nose, so she had it fixed. Jennifer Flowers also got her bundle. What did Flowers do? She moved to Florida and opened a strip club. Her Gypsy Rose Lee moment. And even Lewinsky, when it was all over, got a job with a group of people who advised people how to lose weight. It was not a good time. Nevertheless, the administration struggled to at least continue to function, even though most of the legislation, which was good legislation. In fact, Clinton had run on a program against Bush in which he had a slogan, which was, "It's the economy, stupid," meaning pay attention to what really matters for the American public. And in fact, during Clinton's time, the economy did grow. And in fact, we had the first balanced budget in years. And so when Clinton left the White House, the economy was zooming along with an actual little bit of money to take down part of the large deficit that had been building in America. We had a lot of arguments about this, particularly about serious economics. And we tried to hold this together. In the meantime, the Americans, of course, being themselves, were going about their own business. When they were at the movies, they were watching Mr. Tom Hanks as Forrest Gump. They were going to Broadway. They were watching a marvelous play by Terrence McNally called Masterclass, which was a play about the great Maria Callas and the masterclass she gave to young singers who hoped to make it big in the Metropolitan. And as for singers on a big scale, we were inheriting a fabulous fortune in Finnish music. Esa-Pekka Salonen, a native Finn, came and in fact led the LA Philharmonic into greatness, which he will soon do because we've hired him as a replacement for Michael Tilson Thomas to lead the San Francisco Orchestra Symphony. We also got the most incredibly gorgeous blonde Finn, Karita Matilai. Magnificent voice, and she sang like the angels above. She shocked the easily shocked American public by coming to the Metropolitan Opera and singing Richard Strauss's magnificent opera, Salome. In Salome, the opera ends in a famous dance to the Seven Veils. In Finland, where I've been several times, they have a habit of taking an outdoor sauna. They just bring a lot of hot stones they've heated into a little cubicle. Then everyone gets naked. Then everybody runs outside after sweating for a while and rolls around in the snow and then comes back inside the sauna to do this over and over again. To me, it's just torture. To the Finns, they have no problem with it. And so it was that Matalé thought that Strauss had written this opera to be authentic. And so while she sang Salome, and you came to the famous dance of the seven veils, which concludes that opera, Matalé took off all the veils, and she was in her birthday suit. Now, if you go to the Metropolitan Opera, as I have several times, you find out that many people sitting in the very expensive seats in the orchestra are Wall Street brokers who are dragged there, bear their wives, and the broker and the Wall Streeter often falls asleep by Act One. But suddenly they were all wide awake to see the famous Carita Matalé in her famous dance of the seven veils. And so it was that this was what Americans were doing. They had already said at the beginning of the Clinton administration goodbye to their most famous evening, nighttime comedian. And that was, of course, a man who had been entertaining them for almost 30 years. Late at night when you couldn't sleep, you could often turn on Johnny Carson. And he said his last goodbye to America in the year that Clinton became president of the United States. Little did Carson know he was saying goodbye to a lot of things, particularly to an America that now was rolling with scandal and was in fact most unhappy with the outcome of the very controversial 2 years with William Jefferson Clinton. And while he left our economy in good shape, he left the moral fiber somewhat shaken, given that Americans actually do believe that married men should either stay married or get divorced, but should not collect a number of girlfriends. And if they were to do so, some Americans think that you'd have the good taste to look around your own town of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is loaded with incredibly talented women, lawyers, CPAs, lobbyists, all who have graduate degrees, who are in fact functionally brilliant and are very good looking. And the ratio of those wonderful women is 10 to 1, 10 women to every one. What a marvelous place Washington is to be assigned and to live in if you're a young male. And then if you're older, you should either make a decision to end your marriage and to marry someone new. After all, Governor Rockefeller, who was then, this is Nelson we're talking about, who became a vice president, did in fact divorce his wife of very long standing and remarry a much younger woman. So these things are, these relationships can be handled in an adult way, a legal way, does not have to result in blackmail. But for some reason, it didn't become the way that the Clintons ended their time in the White House. In fact, I often thought that I would have thought better of Hillary if she had divorced Bill. But they came together, and by God, they left together. She, of course, went on to be a senator, not from Arkansas, but from New York, to live in New York, for the Clintons to found a foundation in New York City. Interestingly, the foundation is located up in Harlem. And then she became Secretary of State. And as you all are better aware than I, then she ran first against Obama, and he won the nomination. She did not. And then she ran again in this last election against Trump and won the popular vote, but not the Electoral College, which is an 18th century institution that needs to be eliminated immediately, and probably will be, given this next president's turn. But we will have to live and see. Right now, we know that the Clinton administration did end, to be followed by another Bush administration, not the older Bush, but the guy they called Junior, who had a much smarter brother who was governor in Texas. But that was another story that was not to be. And it is in the Bush, second Bush, that we have that enormously and disastrous event in American history known as 9/11, when the Twin Towers come down and a blow is struck, a blow that then takes us off on silly adventures to places like Afghanistan. We are still involved to this very day in the war that we are not winning in Afghanistan. But we are told it will soon end. I hope to live long enough to see that end of what has been a military disaster for us, matching our disaster in Vietnam. So it is that we march forward. I'm not sure next week whether we will have a chance to do Bush, because I think next week we will have a lecture by an art historian, obviously about art, which is obviously not my field. So we'll have to wait to come back the following week to do Bush Jr. and see where we can get in trying to explain that most difficult 4 years, followed then by the 8, and I'm quite prejudiced, but I will say it, great years of Barack Obama, a president to be trusted and to be much loved. So I've told you about the agenda to come. I can understand that the Clinton years might have not been as distressful to you as it was for me. Many people still admire Clinton. He lost the admiration of many, though, particularly of former President Carter. Once the administration was finished and gone, Carter announced, quote, he will be remembered only as the second president to have been impeached, end quote. And that will not be the case for all of us. Some can see good that was done, and can see error, and some can be very forgiving of errors made, choices that went wrong, and a time of trouble that saw the Clintons at least escape alive from the White House, from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and go on to have another life for themselves. They do a lot of good work now with the Clinton Foundation, and they try and keep their lives together. and not be plagued by the bad parts of the past world. Thank you all for listening this afternoon. I don't take questions, as you know, but if you want to send me an email, which several of you do, I'm glad to receive them and glad to know you were alive and you were listening.
Thank you, Patrick.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you.